You're listening to Vote Her In, a partnership between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive, exploring the movement to elect our first woman president.
Are you la listening?
Hi, I'm Kelly Pollock, and this is Vote Her In, a collaboration between author Rebecca Sive and Two Broads Talking Politics, where we are looking at the movement to elect our first woman president. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now to introduce our guest today.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Kelly. I wanted to tell you all that I actually wrote something out today because when we were just chatting a moment ago, Linda Hirshman, who's our very special guest today, is both a fabulous person and quite a serious and sometimes intimidating. But I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation because Linda's one of those important authors who's been at this work about feminist issues and equal opportunity for women and equal justice for several decades. Her most recent book is called Reckoning, the Epic Battle Against Sexual Abuse and Harassment. And we thought it would be good in light of this appears to be impending impeachment of, among other things, a serial harasser as our president, that it might be a good time to just ask Linda to visit with us and share with us what she's concluded about these matters and how they relate to what our first woman president may or may not do or be like. So I thought we would just launch in and ask Linda to share with us. I know she's doing a bunch of talks and a symposium to share with us her views on what we ought to be reckoning with as we look ahead.
The Reckoning, that's a great introduction. Thank you, Rebecca. And Kelly, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I guess things are changing so rapidly that it's a little hard for me, even I, who call myself Cassandra, to tell the future at this moment. It feels like there's no steady ground to stand on. But I will say that there's an old saying, the best union organizer is a bad supervisor. And I think to some extent the extreme experience of seeing then candidate Donald Trump say out loud what many men do, as we know, in the wake of the Me Too movement, what many men do in private, seeing him say it out loud and then be elected to the highest office in the country was a kind of shocking exposure to American women, which I am hoping will have the effect of organizing the union, just like a bad supervisor is the best union organizer.
And so when you think about that, could you share with us, Linda, your sense of what the trajectory has been, including those statements by the president, but how you believe that the Me Too movement could arise as forcefully as it has, and could that have happened, 30 years ago when you wrote your first book about women's equality?
So I look at social movements over time. And the new book, The Reckoning, starts in 1969 when Ted Kennedy drove off the bridge at Chappaquiddick. Right. So I have a very long view. But as to the very current, what we call the Me Too movement, or the very modern manifestations of the women's resistance to sexual abuse and harassment, I think the real Stonewall moment, if you will, was, after many years of hard work, was when Gretchen Carlson took down Roger Ailes in 2016. So that was the first time that a woman directly took on a powerful man and brought him down. And this was well before the election of Donald Trump. So you had and then a year after Trump was elected, the New York Times and the New Yorker in rapid succession published their articles about Harvey Weinstein. So I think that what you had was, and this is always the story in social movements, a crack in the establishment. So when Gretchen Carlson took on Roger Ailes and the Murdochs did not back him, you saw a crack in the establishment. And you always have to look for that when you think that a movement is going to make a big move up. And then American women, and it was certainly partly their own fault, especially white women voters, elected Donald Trump to be president of the United States under the electoral college system that we have. And immediately after he was inaugurated, there was another very common sign of a movement on the move, and that was a mass demonstration in the form of the first Women's March. So I wouldn't put the critical moment at any. I would put it as a collective of all of those events coming so close together in 2016 and 2017, and so once, if you take those as a collective event, then you see the impact of the new media technology in the form of the internet and social media, allowing movement actors to connect with one another, the increased expression of the feeling of insult that someone who would speak that way about women would be, elected to the highest office in the land. And so you get from 2016 to 2018, the vote numbers among white women voters went from 3-point margin for Trump to a 50-50 split. And even though that may not seem like very virtuous behavior, and in fact is not very virtuous behavior, it's enough to make a huge difference since white women are such a high percentage of the electorate. Just that change of that percentage of voting is enough to make a big political difference. So I would make a string of events like that, and that sort of tees us up for today. The reason that I am less confident in predicting the future at this very moment is that you have several respectable female candidates in the Democratic primary for president. And the numbers in that primary have started to move in the last few weeks. So I just don't know yet what's going to happen. And also the eruption of the proposed impeachment of the president and the justified or unjustified fallout in terms of the conversation about questionable behavior on the part of the male frontrunner in the Democratic primary. And then when I turned my Twitter feed on today, I learned that the third frontrunner in the Democratic primary just had coronary surgery. So I'm less than my usual confident self about saying that I can predict exactly what is going to happen next. I will say this. We have sort of two big things happening at once. One is the social movement that we call the Me Too movement, even though I would argue that it started in 1969. And the other is the election of 2020. And although they relate to one another, they aren't completely the same thing. So in the movement arena, the thing that I have been watching is the backlash because anybody who studies feminism knows that it's one thing to make a big move forward, the publication of the feminine mystique, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Supreme Court decision establishing sexual harassment as a violation of the Civil Rights Act in 1986. It's one thing to move forward, but there is always a ferocious and seductive backlash. And so the feminist movement is taking comparatively long time to gain real social change, in part because we are so vulnerable to the backlash. So that's what I've been watching since I published my book in June. I've been watching the backlash, and it predictably came. It came predictably, as it often does, from our friends in the liberal media. I was particularly taken with the article by Jane Mayer in the New Yorker attempting to exonerate liberal friend Al Franken. And yet, in fact, that backlash, and there was a piece by Emily Yoffe in Reason magazine as well, that backlash is meeting a really robust resistance from the new kids on the block, the young, internet-connected and empowered feminists of the Me Too movement, journalists of the Me Too movement, pushed back robustly against Jane Mayer, and I believe they stopped it. I think that Jane Mayer and the people at the defending Al Franken thought that they had broken through, and that there was going to be a real retreat from the most extreme position by the Me Too movement. But instead of retreating, I was telling someone that the young feminist reporters of the internet got into the taxi cabs in Paris and rattled to the front and stopped the initiative. And so what we've got now is pretty much trench warfare. They stopped it. And I was really shocked and delighted to see that happen. And so we were at stasis, in my opinion, which was vastly better than what happened the last time there was a backlash leveled at the feminist movement. And then a couple of days ago, I knew it was coming because I now know these journalists. But a couple of days ago, the piece that Erin Carmone and Rebecca Traister had been working on in New York Magazine came out, and I also know that there are a number of additional accusers of Al Franken who have not yet come forward. I knew that. And they added a ninth accuser to the 8 that Jane Mayer had brushed aside so easily. And so if you can get to trench warfare, then that enables you to gather your forces and try another initiative. I was surprised it came so quickly, but I think it's very meaningful if the feminist movement can hold the line. And of course, it's always our liberal allies who we count on to support us, who weaken and, do damage.
Just one follow-up question, and I know Kelly's one of these very savvy young feminists we were talking about on the internet, so I know she's got bunches of stuff to ask you. But just to follow up on one point, you had said that there was sort of two separate movements, the Me Too movement, or two separate circumstances, and the second being the election in 2020. And I guess, I don't know if you meant to say this, but it strikes me, but I want to hear your thoughts about this, that it can't help but be the case that, any woman who's been kind of had her consciousness risen, so to speak, by the Me Too movement wouldn't feel more disposed to, for instance, as you pointed out, working for one of those Democratic women candidates. I wonder if you see a kind of something like that or think it might occur.
I think that women are very unreliable political allies. We are so scattered among and live with, this is sleeping with the enemy, so to speak. We live among the class of people. Obviously, not every man is implicated in this, but we live among the class of people who have superior power over us. And it makes us vulnerable to free riding and strike breaking and the kinds of, putting other interests first and making private bargains with our wealthier male partners and a bunch of behaviors that don't bedevil other movements. So it's not going to be a perfect one-to-one correlation between raised consciousness from the Me Too movement, if you'll allow me to start it in 2016, and the election and the support of particular women candidates in the election. Many things are at play in the election. There are racial memories. There are very reasonable concerns that many black voters, particularly older black voters, have that the threat to their well-being is existential, and they have to support the person that they think is most likely to beat Donald Trump. So there's a lot going on here. I do think that the forces that produced the Me Too movement are responsible socially for the presence of at least 3 very respectable and viable female candidates in the field, which is already a change. And if you look at the 3 of them, none of them rose as the tail on the kite of a more powerful male partner.
Right.
They are the first candidates of real modern feminism. And so all of those social changes are at play in this absolutely critical election. So I think that the fact that the backlash was able to take down Senator Gillibrand so quickly with almost surgical precision does not fill me with feelings of great confidence in the liberal political process. But it was a direct confrontation between the Me Too movement and where most civilian Democrats are. And I think that Harris and Klobuchar and Warren all have very good records on the issues, the abortion rights and so forth. So I think that their candidacies will represent the rising up of female political power without presenting the hardest question to the electorate, to the Democratic electorate, which is, do you really want to take down that cozy, sweet, liberal, smoochy comedian guy that you love to see in the Senate all the time? That was the hardest question. And you never succeed with the most extreme question first. So she was a sacrifice.
Yeah.
So I wonder, we're talking about this backlash in sort of a global way, but I'm wondering what you think the backlash against individual women is going to do to the future of whether women want to come forward with their stories. I mean, we saw that with the Kavanaugh hearings, right? That Christine Blasey Ford's life has been essentially ruined from having come forward, and yet it did nothing to keep Kavanaugh off the court. So do you think that women seeing that and seeing the sort of larger backlash against people like Senator Gillibrand is going to cause, any sort of freezing effect of women who want to come forward with these stories?
I think that there's first of all, I do not think that Christine Blasey Ford's life will be ruined. Okay, I do not think that. First of all, she's had an extremely good and productive life already. Secondly, it did not ruin Anita Hill's life. Anita Hill has gone on to be an immensely productive member of society and a real teacher and voice for the good guys until the present moment. So I think that you have to be careful to not take the horrible first year after somebody gets into the media crosshairs as an example of what their whole life is going to be like. Many of the people that Rebecca and Erin profiled had a terrible time at first, and depending on their relative power positions, paid a price. But I don't want it to be out there in the universe that people's entire lives are ruined. I think that any woman would be well advised to be absolutely terrified and very, very, very reluctant to step out into the limelight and be the accuser of a powerful man. That was dangerous before the Me Too movement and the Kavanaugh hearings, and will probably be dangerous until, I don't know, I'm just a faint memory. But I do, and so the people who actually do that act are always in a very vulnerable position. But people are willing to do that. They are willing to say, you can't fire me because I'm gay, like Franklin Kameny said in 1957 in the middle of the Lavender Scare. They are willing to throw the first rock or penny at Stonewall. There will always be people whose sense of outrage or their commitment to the well-being of the group will motivate them, and we should be very grateful to them. So I have faith that they will be deterred, and I have faith that after the deterrent effect washes over the movement, there will still be people left with the courage and the altruism to step forward.
So related to that, Linda, I've been reflecting back and, on this and realizing that yes, the sort of public and institutional climate is in some ways more supportive of women who come forward. But I think, the individual has to make that choice, to do that. And I'm wondering whether you think that as we increase the number of women in powerful institutional positions, that can give these women heart as well as their own courage and determination to move forward. And in that context, whether you think specifically a woman president would really have a big impact. Yes,
of course. I can't now to save my life remember who it was that said in Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's recent book, she said that she had been inspired by it was E. Jean Carroll. Jean Carroll, the advice columnist, said that she was inspired to come forward by the example of Christine Blasey Ford. So I think that the emergence of women always is an inspiration and a reassurance to other women that they will not commit career suicide. Felicia Sonmez, who's the journalist that was recently the subject of Emily Yoffe's piece in Reason Magazine, has a very good job at the wonderful Washington Post. So it isn't always career suicide. And I think that they will be inspired by of course they will be inspired both by the sight of women succeeding. And also, have you noticed that there are really a substantial number of very powerful women senators and stuff who are telling stories of their abuse and assault? Right. And so hearing those stories coming from women who have made a life around that terrible experience and gone on to positions of power and authority, I think is also a very important piece of it. So, of course, I think that they will be inspired. It's an indirect phenomenon. I don't think that someone whose boss harassed her and needs to eat is going to come forward because there's a female president of the United States. What happens is that the temperature of the society changes, and the idea gets out that women are entitled to better lives than the ones they're leading. So having a woman make a viable run for president raises it starts to work destructively on the idea that your lesser fate is natural or deserved or ineluctable. You start to think you have aspirations for yourself. I saw this very powerfully when I wrote my book about the gay revolution, Victory, the Triumphant Gay Revolution, when I talked to those white men, not to put too fine a point on it. They had expectations that the world would treat them well. They were raised with it. And then when they realized they were gay, they felt a loss of something that they thought they had. Right. So when the gay revolution came along, it restored their expectation that their life would be better. And that, I think, is something that seeing women in particularly the highest executive office in the land, having a woman crack that glass ceiling spreads a message that women's lives can be better. And then it takes different forms depending on the individual.
And speaking of, before we, come to a close here, speaking of it taking different forms and going back to where you started, and you were pointing out the numbers on white women voting or not for Hillary Clinton, do you see any kind of, going back to, say, being an organizer, do you see any strong avenues to pursue with women who did not vote for Hillary in light of what we're now seeing, strong, independent women, as you pointed out? If you were organizing in one of these campaigns, would you go down this street or that street?
Right. Well, my favorite pollster, Rachel Bidikofer, says that in a time of extreme partisanship, turnout is the answer to everything. So if she's right, and it's a very powerful argument, I happen to be writing a book about abolition now. So I'm thinking about a period in American history that's sort of similar to what we're going through at the moment. And it was extreme partisanship, okay? And so if I were organizing a campaign, I would put my efforts in the, like Willie Sutton said about the banks, where the money is. And there would be a hierarchy. And college-educated white women would be, third in my hierarchy. Non-white voters, young voters, college-educated white women. And I would try to turn them out because there are so many white women that it just takes a tiny percentage. And also by ineluctable fiat of biology, we are distributed into the states where your basic cosmopolitan liberal voters no longer live. So that we're doubly valuable in that way. And so I would absolutely try and put resources into just turning a couple percentage points among those women. But it's going to, what do I want to say? It's not, you're not going to recruit them on the basis of cases like Al Franken. They're going to be moved by that staggeringly insulting prospect of the Access Hollywood tape, and now he's been credibly accused of rape. You know, things that are pretty hard to justify and brush aside. But yes, I think I absolutely do. I was very, I know that, if I were a woman of color, I would be furious with white women for our faithlessness. But I was actually, being a cynical old lady, heartened by just that couple of percentage points.
Right. And it's, in my favorite other state, which is Michigan, it was less than 11,000 votes. So it's certainly a doable deal.
I have said this on this series before, but I think, as a somewhat younger woman, although I'm 41, so I'm not super young at this point, but, that I think I grew up with this idea that we were sort of past sexism somehow. And, I think that this past couple of years has been a real awakening for me, that what I thought was a sort of institutional change was really just a privileged existence that I had been living, that I hadn't, had to deal with a lot of sexism or harassment or any of those things. And so I'm so glad to sort of be being awakened and learning more. And I'm glad that people are supporting women who are coming forward, even if not everyone is supporting them.
Right. Well, you did have a blessed life, I will say, because almost no woman that I know of any age could say what you just said. And when I give my book talks, it shocked me a lot at first when I started talking about the Reckoning book, that at every book talk, someone comes up to me with a story about being raped. It was chilling at first. I've gotten a little used to it now. But that was a real example. I mean, it's anecdote, so I can't say it's data, but it's a real example of how widespread it is.
Yeah.
So you can buy my book, Reckoning, the Epic Battle Against Sexual Abuse and Harassment, at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or at your best of all, at your local independent bookstore. And thank you for your hard work. At the end of the day, law and the democratic governance is women's best ally. We cannot live in the state of nature.
Yes. Thank you for that, Linda, and thank you for your friendship and support and guidance for all of us. We'll hope to check back at you. All right. We'll check back with you later in the year.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Linda.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.